Good afternoon, everybody. Good to see you all. Okay, today's presenters have a little note for you all. While you were in the waiting room, if you were in the waiting room, they posted a little chat message that asking you to complete a super quick little brief Mentimeter quiz. Heather just pasted the link right into the chat now. So if you go down to click on the chat icon at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a little link to the Mentimeter survey. Just click on that. It's just 5 quick questions, and that will help their presentation today. Okay, so we can go ahead and get started. Isn't it nice when we all have access? I had some accessibility issues as we were starting, as I was trying to log in. But there are folks who always have problems with accessibility. So it's really helpful, I think, that we make our presentations, we make our teaching available for the broadest group of learners possible, particularly if we know that we have learners with accessibility needs. So today we have Dr. David Halpin as one of our presenters. He's an instructional designer and trainer for the Center for Innovation in Teaching and Learning at Radford University Carilion. And we also have Vianne Greek, who is the Director of Digital Initiatives for Medical Education over at the Virginia Tech Carilion School of Medicine and Virginia Tech. So they're going to present today on accessibility and inclusion in teaching across the medical education continuum. Again, if people have just popped on, there is a little link in the chat. So if you go to the bottom of your screen and click on the chat, you'll see a link. Click on the link and just complete that super brief survey that will help David and Vianne with their presentation, if you don't mind. Go ahead and take it away, folks.
Thank you all for coming here today and for doing the Mentimeter question. We'd like to get a sense ahead of time on what people's perceptions are as to what some of the barriers are for education for students with disabilities. And in this case, it's presentation material for medical students with disabilities. And David, if you could switch over to the Mentimeter screen, and we'll see what is popping up as you are completing the one question with 5 answers. And so far, we've had 2 people fill it in so far. So we'll give you a few more minutes to add more information. About every minute or so. Look at that. More answers. What I like about this particular presentation and Mentimeter is as you fill in the answers, more things pop up, which is great. So we'll give it one more refresh, and then we'll switch back to the presentation. Look at that. There you go. Thank you so much. So David, and you can keep filling this in throughout the presentation. You can keep clicking on it. But for right now, we'll just move on. And one thing on this, what we wanted to come across was access. And I'm glad I saw the word access come up rather large toward the end there, because that seems to be the main issue. And the main barrier really is ableism. It is society's low expectations of what people are able to do. And then, so what this has here is an image representing a line of people going through a door that's labeled non-disabled only, and then a wall separating people with disabilities. There's somebody in a wheelchair, cane, crutch user, and what might be a migraine. And intentionally or unintentionally, and I would go with unintentionally, most of the time we are creating these barriers just because we don't think top of mind as to what folks with disabilities have to go through. And so I wanted to talk a few about the medical education continuum and some of the systemic barriers that arrive there. They start from the home, from very young. If the parents don't have the financial or health insurance needs to take care of some of the disabilities that children have, they're going to start off having some issues. If the K through 12 situation isn't set up for specialized Education, then we're going to have some barriers there. Access to college, physical and digital accessibility access there. Getting into medical school, there's all kinds of barriers there, and that carries all the way through graduate medical education and beyond. So let's first talk about what these systemic barriers could be. And Cabrera et al. Talks about the DSRP way of defining systems issues, and they talk about distinctions, systems, relationships, and perspectives. So the distinction, we'll start with that, is anything that's different, they're other than. In fact, we make them fill in a form that proves to us that they are other than. So talk about a cool little system that makes you separate yourselves from others. Then we have various types of other systems that could impact people with disabilities. There's funding systems, there's healthcare systems, technology, access, prioritization. If there's money available for a new initiative, where do you put it? And often the people with disabilities are left at the bottom of that list. Relationships, so this is between the systems and also between people. It's all about inclusion versus exclusion and belonging versus outsider. So the question to ask here is, if you are not being inclusive in your approach, who are you excluding from participating? Who are you treating as an outsider? And then we have perspectives, social beliefs and attitudes. And it pops up on LinkedIn and all social media all the time, so there's no greater barrier for people with disabilities than society's low expectations of their competencies and abilities. And today's talk is trying to talk about accessibility and inclusion and teaching across the medical education continuum. What we're trying to do is go beyond the blue tag. And we're going to do that by broadening what the word disability actually means. So our learning objectives are to list and compare 3 categories of disabilities, define the terms accessibility, accommodation, diversity, and inclusion. And then your challenge is to employ 2 strategies for creating content that reflect your learners' unique identities and experience. So my portion here will be on accessibility, and then David will talk about inclusion. So our goal here with this is to broaden our definition of what a disability is. As indicated by our title, we want to go beyond that blue tag. Often when we think about disability, we just think about physical disabilities, blindness, deafness, wheelchairs. We see those all the time. But definition of disability is broader than that. And Meeks et al. Adds 2 categories to it. It says cognitive disabilities and chronic illness. So cognitive disabilities could be dyslexia, anxiety, ADHD. Chronic illness could be something like cancer, migraines, or diabetes. And when we look at these 3 categories, we can identify each group as having different challenges. The challenge for the physically disabled people is actually getting access to the environment. This can be physical access, such as curbs and elevators and ramps, or it could be digital access, such as captions, screen readers, things like that. The challenge for people with cognitive disabilities is understanding. They may be able to get to the learning environment. They're going to have some difficulties processing the content. And then for chronic illness, the main challenge is managing their energy. There may be more frequent breaks, and they may have some issues with medications and trying to manage those chronic illnesses. But what they all have in common is that they all need more time. And time is something that's also at a premium for us educators, especially once a class is already rolling. We have limited time in blocks and rotations to make adjustments. And so we propose, by way of this presentation, that we start saving time on the implementation side by building in accessibility in the planning stage for your course. So this is the period when you have more time available to be creative and make adjustments. If you neglect accessibility and universal design for learning in the planning stage, then you'll have to provide accommodations in the implementation stage where time is really at a premium. Let's take a look at what these words actually mean. So accessibility is the practice of creating materials and environments so that they are able to be accessed by people with disabilities. Accommodations are an academic adjustment to the learning environment, curriculum, or use of auxiliary aids that allow students with disabilities to have equivalent access to the education as non-disabled students. The key here, though, is that accommodations generally only benefit affected students. Universal design for learning involves creating inclusive learning environments that reduce barriers, accommodate diverse learner needs, and provides all students with equal opportunities to succeed. And so the key here is if you incorporate UDL, it'll benefit all students. So the next 3 slides I use primarily for illustration purposes to show you what would happen if you think about accessibility and UDL prior to the implementation of your course. I've listed 10 common accommodations for the didactic setting. The text is small, so I apologize for that, but it gives you a quick visual representation. So this first slide shows the 10 accommodations, which include extra time, the use of stools during the labs, periodic breaks for physical and cognitive well-being, and the need to provide notes during before the lecture. The second slide shows what would happen if we made changes to the course to where we could eliminate possibly up to 7 of these 10 accommodations. And if we remove time restrictions, added stools, built-in periodic breaks, and provided notes for every lecture, then if we address it on the front end, we're only left with a few things on the back end. So that's a lot more manageable for us on the implementation side. And so that's our call to action for you, to look for ways that you can improve your course and add ways to make it better for all students so that you as a faculty member only have to deal with fewer accommodations as you go. So before we continue, let's do a bit of a knowledge check. Heather has created a poll for us. We have 2 questions in that poll. The first question asks you to pair the categories of disabilities with the challenge that they face. It's a matching question, so you get a prompt with a drop-down to select your options. And the second question asks you to pair the definitions and benefits of the accommodations and universal design. And again, that is also a matching style question, so use the drop-down to make those selections. Okay, so we just talked about the didactic setting. So beyond the didactic setting, this presentation is about across the medical education continuum. So we'll go through a couple of ideas and tips for reducing barriers in the other settings as well. So for lab setting, we may be dealing with some sensitivities to chemicals, the need for specialized seating or furniture. There might be some needs for planned breaks, visual aids, etc. I'm not going to list all of the different types here. They're on the screen and they'll be available on the slide deck after the presentation. In the clinical setting, we suggest having a pre-rotation visit with the student to ensure they'll be able to access the facility. Also address any attitudinal barriers for the people who work at that facility. There may be a need to change the order of rotations, such as breaking up 2 intensive rotations with a less intensive one, just to be able to conserve that energy and mental capacity. It's also important to note that the Office for Civil Rights considers a service animal at the same level as it does a wheelchair. It's considered a right and not an accommodation. They've ruled on this several times, according to Meeks et al. In the book. In the GME side, many of the things that apply in the clinical and clerkship side carry through to residency and beyond. So again, we have making sure that things are accessible, flexible scheduling to allow for replenishing energy for those with chronic illness and cognitive issues. We suggest some mentoring programs, providing role models, and implementing training and awareness plans to address biases for competency and stigma. And then making sure that your career advancement criteria are inclusive and they don't include any bias. For the continuing medical education side, a lot of this has to do with the planners of these programs. So it's making sure that professional development opportunities are accessible and that we include a diverse group of voices. Think about the physical accessibility as well for conferences, such as elevators, ramps, visual accessibility, such as captions and transcripts for all your ongoing education efforts. And I'll share a quick story from I recently attended in Orlando, where at the previous venue, not this one, there was an elevator that had only a touchscreen and had no braille, and there was a blind person who couldn't operate the elevator. And their solution was that he had to wake up the neighbor in the next room and have them help him with the elevator. I'm going to say that's not an acceptable way of dealing with this. The other person that told me this story, she herself was a wheelchair user, and they couldn't find the key that would lift her up to the floor that they needed to get her to with the wheelchair. So they made her go to the garbage elevator and use that to get to the second floor. These are all things that if you're planning a conference, please make sure that your experience for the users is not that. So for the future venues, the accessibility team's always been included on making sure that the venues themselves are accessible. So I hope this gives you a sense of things you could be thinking about as you prepare for your learning environment in any of these settings. Heather, I don't know if you're still planning on attaching the resources in the chat, but they will be available on the website as soon as she will post them. So there's about 10 pages worth of information about fostering an inclusive environment, about accessibility checks, things like that. And I hope you'll take a look at that. And David will be talking about something called +1. And I hope that as you plan your course for the next term or the next block or the next year, that you incorporate one or two of these ideas into the future of medical education here at VDCSOM and Corona. Take it away, David.
Okay. So we're going to move on to talking about inclusion. And first off, thank you for everyone for showing up. I see some names I recognize, so it's good to see the names. So first off, you often hear about DEI, which stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion. Sadly, this has become rather controversial and political, but that doesn't discount its importance to education. And Vianne was discussing accessibility, and so you see we can add the A on there for accessibility, and we end up with DEIA. And I've started seeing it flipped around, and when you do that, you have IDEA, which I think is a much nicer term and encompasses all of those concepts: inclusion, diversity, equity, accessibility. They're all somewhat related, but I want to start off by talking about a couple definitions. So with diversity, that relates to individual differences that you see here and group social differences that can be engaged to achieve excellence in learning, research, scholarship, and administrative and support services for our learners. And then if we switch over to inclusion, inclusion involves the active, intentional, and ongoing engagement with diversity in people, in the curriculum, in the co-curriculum, and in communities with which individuals might connect. And so it's tied to diversity, but it goes further than diversity. And I've often heard an analogy, a sandwich analogy, which I like, that says that diversity is having all of the ingredients you need for a sandwich on your counter, spread out before you. And inclusion is putting all those ingredients together to make a tasty sandwich. And so that's what we want to do. We want to make sure we're using all of our resources that are available to us. Now, here's some related terms you may be familiar with. Separation in the top left, to me, is similar to segregation, where a certain group of others is set aside from the main group. And next is exclusion, which is when you leave certain people out of your little bubble. You're not segregating them, you're just leaving them out. And then we have integration. Well, they're in the bubble, but you're still leaving them out. And finally, inclusion, where you're making an active effort to include everyone. And when you do that, you find out that there are no others because you're all together on one team. And here's a quote. It's a poem that ties into that, and it's only 4 lines. He drew a circle that shut me out, heretic, rebel, a thing to flout. But love and I had the wit to win. We drew a circle that took him in. And so going back to that circle, that bubble, we want to draw a circle that takes in all of our learners and includes everyone. Now here's kind of a related cartoon that I've seen a lot that ties back to what Vianne was talking about, but it also ties to inclusion. So in this cartoon, we have a set of kids who are waiting to get into school, and there's a man shoveling the steps. And a disabled child, he says, "Could you please shovel the ramp?" And the man says, "Well, all these other kids are waiting to use the stairs. When I get through shoveling them off, I will clear the ramp for you." And the child says, "But if you shovel the ramp, we can all get in." And so the thing to keep in mind is that being more inclusive doesn't take away from anyone else. If you attempt to incorporate more inclusive practices into your teaching or your work environment, it won't hurt you. Now, the man who's shoveling probably thought he was doing a good thing by offering to shovel the ramp, which is to say that most of us don't intentionally want to leave people out. We just may not know the best ways to be more inclusive. And so I'd like to approach this from the perspective of communication theory. So communication theory describes how information is passed from one place to another. And every communication involves a sender, a source, who has a message to present. And the sender has to encode that message to prepare it for delivery to a recipient. And they utilize a channel or multiple channels to deliver that message. And then the receiver receives the message and then has to decode it. And you'll notice here we have noise that can interfere at any step along the way. And there can be many sources of that noise, and they serve as barriers to effective communication. And in our case, learning. They're barriers to learning. And you'll notice these ovals, these fields of experience, are going to determine how the sender encodes and delivers the message and how the receiver decodes and interprets that message. And so the more you take into account your learners' unique characteristics, their backgrounds, experiences, preferences, all those things, the more effective you'll be at being an instructor, a preceptor, a clinician, or a coworker. And that means being more inclusive. So let's talk a bit about how you can create more inclusive learning environments. And here's a definition I like for inclusive design. It is design that considers the full range of human diversity with respect to ability, language, culture, gender, age, and other forms of human difference. So awareness, compassion, and togetherness form the core values of inclusive design. So that means awareness to recognize the diversity in your learners, compassion to include the needs of those who are different from us, and togetherness in sharing positive outcomes of the process. So prior to your experience, and this means whatever learning experience that you are developing, there are some things you can do as you're getting ready. So the first thing is to try to understand your learners' characteristics, their backgrounds, their prior knowledge and experiences, and their potential needs. And you can conduct a needs assessment to do this, and there are a lot of different ways to do that. But certainly for medical students, we have a good set of demographic data already on the students who are coming in. And by assessing the requirements of your learners, you can design learning materials that meet the needs of diverse learners. And so when you're creating activities for your learners, here's a few things that you can do to be more inclusive. First off, you can make your expectations clear. So don't leave room for ambiguity in what you're asking your learners to do. The clearer you are, the more likely everyone will understand what you're asking for. And then based on who your learners are, look for potential misunderstandings. The next thing is to have clear deadlines. What is expected and when is it expected? If we're talking about traditional course assignments, you might want to perhaps even reassess your deadlines, because deadlines that are too strict can be inclusive. And Vianne talked about time a little bit earlier. And you don't always know what's going on in people's lives. So a little grace shown at the right time can make a big difference in people's lives. And so looking at your deadlines can be one way to do that. And different cultures look at deadlines differently than we do. So you have to keep that in mind. Another thing is to build in multiple opportunities for you to provide your learners with feedback. And I call these mileposts or check-ins. And it shows the learners that you care and gives you an opportunity to see how they're doing. Other things include sending frequent reminders, announcements. And again, remember, by doing these things, you're not hurting anyone. None of your learners are being excluded by making efforts to include everyone. Another thing you can do while you're creating activities is you want to make sure to create diverse learning materials that incorporate multiple perspectives, examples, and case studies. Obviously, we want to do that. I was recently reviewing a set of culturally diverse case studies, and I was amazed at the variety that they had included. One involved a young undocumented teenager. Another one had an elderly Asian woman. Another one had a young woman from Mexico who was working as a laborer. One was an elderly Iranian immigrant. One was a young Afghani woman. And you can include cases that feature LGBTQ people and the issues they face, young people, elderly, families, a wide variety. Because data from the US Census shows that less than half of the nation's children age 15 and under are single race, non-Hispanic, and white. And so not only are you being more inclusive towards your learners, but you're helping them prepare for the population that they will be working with. Because diseases don't discriminate. Your learners will have to interact with all different types of people. And this image is from the Patient Diversity Campaigns. Very, very good site. But just as important is that by ensuring that learners' cultures and identities are reflected in the learning environment, you're helping them develop a deeper understanding of the content. This connection between their own experiences and the educational material enhances the significance of their learner and increases their engagement. And it's also called culturally responsive teaching. So other things you can do are to create activities that provide learners with options for how they complete them. This could be, for example, having them decide on the topics they want to use for an activity, or giving them multiple ways to meet the requirements of the activity. This could be, say, a literature review on a controversial topic that they are interested in, or perhaps a health assessment assignment on an underserved population of their choice. Or perhaps they can choose topics or cases related to an identity of theirs. And also you can leave room for creativity, which can allow them to bring out some of their background and their interests. Now, Vianne touched on this idea of +1 thinking, and this is a component of universal design for learning, which is an educational framework that attempts to reduce barriers to learning and maximize accessibility for the widest range of learners. And it says, for every interaction that you create, offer another way for learners to get the same information. And here's some examples here. Another example might be, and I think I saw this earlier, if students don't seem to take notes well in class, you can provide your notes ahead of time, say on the learning management system. This could be particularly of interest to, say, international students who may have a difficult time taking notes because they have to process a second language before they can write the information down. And so it takes them longer to write notes sometimes. So that's just another idea. So during your learning experience, you can provide opportunities for learners to share something about themselves, to include a part of their identity into what they're doing. And by doing this, you can then learn more about their lived experiences. You might learn about their family. You might learn about their struggles growing up. You might learn about their interests. Do they have pets? I know several people here have cats already. Are they a Swiftie? You might learn that grandma loves heavy metal music. And to me, that's much more interesting than just having a line of unknown, formless people passing through your experience. In some of my courses, I have activities that encourage learners to be creative or share something personal about themselves. What brought them to the point they're at? For example, an essay that asks, why are you here studying a healthcare field? What brought you here? The answers can be very interesting and sometimes quite moving. And by doing so, you start to see them as complex human beings. And again, this can subsequently influence the design of future activities. And I always tell everyone that you should always approach your learning experiences with the idea that it is in constant revision. Every learner question should be saved because every learner question reflects the backgrounds, experiences, and diversity of your learners. So when I get an email from a learner that says, can you explain this more? Or I don't understand this, or any kind of question, I immediately make a note of that for next time. I say, okay, I received maybe a couple questions related to this. Maybe I should rethink how I explain things and how I ask for the assignments to be completed. Some learners may be reluctant to ask questions or point out discrepancies in learning materials, and this could be due to anxiety or cultural differences. In some cultures, learners are not encouraged to speak up or ask questions of instructors, so it's important to keep that in mind. It's also important to make sure that you use current examples and references and make them relevant to your learners, and to be careful of jokes and cultural references. And that doesn't mean you can't be humorous, but you have to be culturally sensitive. And be aware that your learners may not always get your jokes. So when I taught courses at Virginia Tech a while back, I had a large number of foreign students in our program, and they were from all over the world. And I realized at some point that my exceedingly clever pop culture references were resulting in blank stares from my learners, because I was talking about the Brady Bunch to people from countries who had never even heard of that. But as I learned more about my students, I was able to incorporate things that they understood better. So for example, I had a lot of Asian students. So when the Lunar New Year came around, I was able to talk about it and wish them a happy Lunar New Year. For my Chinese students, I learned to say Xinyin Kuai Le during the Lunar New Year. And another example is just a couple of weeks ago, I made a reference to a Seinfeld episode, and this was with the medical students. I made a reference to a Seinfeld episode regarding standardized patients, and the students had the same blank look that my students had when I talked about the Brady Bunch. Because they'd heard of Seinfeld, but they hadn't actually seen it. And so as you get older, you have to update your comedy material. Although it was a funny episode. And it was relevant to what we were talking about. So the other thing you want to do is foster a welcoming, supportive, and safe space where all learners feel accepted and valued. And one good way to do that is to facilitate peer work. So if you create activities that require participation from everyone, and you encourage your learners to interact with each other, they're going to learn more about each other. And you're also including everyone. So you have to design the activities to make sure everyone's included. Even the student who used to sit in the back of the room and never said anything, looked at their paper and didn't look up. You have to try to get them involved. And getting people with diverse backgrounds to work together is the best way to foster a respect for differences and to make sure everyone's included. And it's even better if you can get them to share something about themselves. So, for example, ask them about a book they read recently. Share the history of or meaning behind their name. A couple weeks ago, I had to go to a retreat out at Smith Mountain Lake, and we played people bingo, where you have the bingo cards and you have to run around and find somebody that meets all of the things on your card to get bingo. Things like that. Also, during your learning experience, promote respectful communication, encourage diverse perspectives, and promote inclusive language. If possible, you want to provide multiple means of assessment. Some students may not perform well on certain types of assessment. Authentic assessment is preferred. Certainly when you're doing clinical types of activities, you're doing more authentic assessment. But ideally, authentic assessment attempts to provide the same conditions students will encounter in the real world. So the closer you can get to that, the better. And then a couple of notes for online courses to make students feel more included. Make sure you're present in the course frequently. Instructor presence is the most important best practice for an online course. And you also have to look for ways to build community, to get the learners interacting. And then consider technology barriers that your learners may have. That's also another critical point. The digital divide does exist between those who are able to take advantage of technology and those who are not. And digital exclusion happens when people are not able to access the benefits of technology. And being digitally excluded, whether because it's a lack of internet access, a lack of digital literacy, or other barriers, marginalizes people. And so certain groups of learners are more likely to face barriers to digital inclusion. And that includes people living in poverty, older adults, people with disabilities, non-native English speakers, or those living in remote or rural areas. When we went through the pandemic, we had a lot of difficulty with some students, being able to get access to all the online materials we were putting out there. And some students would actually drive to the building, the hospital, and sit in the parking lot so they could take advantage of our Wi-Fi. So keep that in mind. And then I want to talk about, again, communication. Just mention troublesome, non-inclusive language. When possible, you want to try to use inclusive language and behaviors. And there are so many examples, but I've included a few here. Brown bag lunch. Freshmen, we have a lot of words that have man at the end of them. And as a society, I think we're slowly trying to move away from that. Things like blacklist and white glove, the colors black and white have long carried opposite connotations, with black representing evil and disgrace, and the blacklist is what you want to put things on there that you don't want, and white connotating decency and purity. Other things include terms like illegal alien, Native American type terms, circle the wagons, and the last one is powwow. Well, I've been using that word for my whole life. But I just recently read something that made me stop and think about it, that said it could potentially be insensitive to Native Americans because a powwow was kind of a sacred ceremony that they undertook. And so I've had to rethink that. But I'm okay with that. It's just I didn't know it. I just always said, hey, let's have a powwow and talk about this, this project we're working on. So you can't be expected to know everything. And then a couple more things. Troublesome behaviors, ignoring pronouns and preferred names. That's obviously more recent development. And I listed stand-up meetings here because Years ago, I worked at a small company, and they like to do kind of fad type things. And so one of the fads at the time was you bring people in for a department meeting, you have everybody stand up for the meeting. And it was supposed to be a 10-minute meeting. Well, at the time I had a bulging disc in my back. And so, okay, we stood up for 10 minutes, but their 10-minute stand-up meeting lasted over an hour. And so this goes back to what Vianne was talking about. You don't always know who has the disability. Not everybody's in a wheelchair. And so I stood there, and after about 10 or 15 minutes, the pain started. And by the end of the meeting, I couldn't walk anymore because of that. So just building that awareness, I think, is the critical thing. And I want to circle back at communication theory to remind you that being inclusive is all about being able to effectively get your message across to your learners. And you do that by being aware of how you encode your message and the channels you use to deliver that message. So you're using multiple channels, giving learners an opportunity to receive your message in different ways that benefits them. And you also do that by respecting the backgrounds, knowledge, experiences, preferences, interests, and other characteristics of your learners. That field of experience that you see there, which represents their lived experiences. And you also do that by being aware of potential noise, those barriers that can interfere with learning, which include technology barriers, language barriers, cultural barriers, disabilities, and by your commitment to being more inclusive. So you have to commit to doing these things, to learning more, to being the guy that's shoveling the snow and realizing, oh, you know what? I can do better because I can shovel the ramp. And that's going to help everybody at once and not single out one person. And so I'm asking you for commitment to being more inclusive. And I end with this, another quote from Pearl S. Buck, who is a famous author who had some very interesting lived experiences that she wrote about. And she says, exclusion is always dangerous. Inclusion is the only safety if we are to have a peaceful world. And so with that, I'll stop.
Thank you all so much for this illuminating conversation. If anybody else has any questions, I'm sure you can contact Vianne or David to ask additional questions or engage in further discussion.
Please
Hope you all have a wonderful rest of the day.